Blue and red lights bounced off the windows of my living room like I was in some sort of B-list action movie. 3 police cruisers idled in my driveway, officers stepping out with confused expressions while neighbors gathered behind hedges and fences like suburban meerkats. I opened the door cautiously, coffee mug in hand, wondering if I was sleepwalking through some bizarre dream. One officer asked flatly if I was preventing a young man from healing. I blinked twice. What? Then I saw her, arms folded, smile smug, voice shrill enough to pierce drywall. Karen from the HOA, standing at the edge of the lawn like she just cast herself in a courtroom drama. According to her, her son required immediate occupancy of my home to recover from emotional trauma. And apparently I was a heartless squatter who refused to give up the house. That's when I actually laughed out loud. To backtrack just a bit, I moved into this house a year ago after retiring from emergency medical services. Peace and quiet, birdsong in the morning, and a backyard big enough to park my kayak and sanity. I got the place legally, fully paid off, with all permits signed and sealed. What I didn't anticipate was the neighborhood's HOA being run by a woman who had the diplomacy of a lawnmower and the entitlement of royalty. Karen had been tolerable at first, occasional snide remarks, some notes about mailbox color compliance, and a few passive-aggressive smiles at community meetings. But this? Calling 911 to try and evict me because her adult son wanted my home as his healing sanctuary? That was a new level of lunacy. The officers, to their credit, weren't exactly buying her Oscar-worthy performance. I could tell by the way they kept glancing between me and her like we were contestants on some deranged game show. She launched into a monologue about trauma, space, and emotional balance, peppering the air with phrases like holistic cleansing and energy realignment. She actually said her son needed the bay windows in my house for sunlight therapy. One officer coughed into his hand to cover a laugh. I invited the officers inside and offered them coffee. Only one accepted, but I noticed another subtly eyeing the immaculate layout of my living room and the shelf full of actual certifications from real institutions. I pulled up the HOA meeting recording from 2 weeks ago on my tablet. In it, Karen could be clearly heard joking about how she'd love to get me out and give the house to her son if she could come up with the right excuse. One of the officers raised an eyebrow as the video played her exact words. The quote went something like, "If we could just pretend he needs to meditate or something, maybe we can get rid of the kayak guy." After watching the video, one officer turned to her and asked, "Ma'am, is your son a licensed tenant on this property? Is there any legal claim or emergency declaration?" The woman's face flushed crimson. She stammered about trauma and boundaries, but the facade was crumbling faster than a sandcastle at high tide. Eventually, the officers concluded there was no crime, no emergency, and certainly no eviction taking place. They left after giving Karen a polite but firm suggestion to avoid misusing emergency services. She stood in my yard steaming like a kettle, fuming that they didn't take her side. Before she left, she hissed something about this not being over. I nodded and replied, "That's what the villain always says in the second act." She didn't find that funny. What she didn't know was that I had already looped in my friend Janine, a sharp-witted civil attorney who loved nothing more than tearing HOA nonsense apart like wrapping paper. I sent her the police audio, the HOA recording, and the security cam footage. She was already preparing a cease and desist letter. But Karen wasn't done. The next morning, I found a flyer taped to my door inviting all HOA members to an emergency meeting about neighborhood wellness and property reallocation for emotional recovery purposes. I actually snorted. She had just rebranded her eviction stunt into a public health initiative. It was equal parts laughable and dangerous, because I knew how some members of the HOA were sheep in sun hats. Later that evening, I got an anonymous call from another resident who'd heard whispers of a vote being planned, one to rezone certain properties for temporary therapeutic housing. Mine was the only one on the list. Karen was trying to put a leash on me using policy instead of police. I checked my calendar and cleared the next few days. This was about to get fun. I spent the rest of the evening organizing every document I had: title deeds, boundary certificates, email chains, recordings, timestamp. Janine texted me with a grinning emoji and asked if I was ready to make this HOA meeting go viral. I replied with a picture of Karen on my doorbell camera trying to reposition my front porch gnome so its back was to her house. The pettiness was unmatched. As I went to bed that night, I locked all my doors, not out of fear, but because I could practically hear the gears turning in Karen's overcaffeinated brain. She had tried playing the emotional sympathy card. She'd tried calling in the cops. She was now going to try bending policy and public opinion. But what she didn't understand was I had dealt with trauma, real trauma. I had pulled people from burning cars, resuscitated overdoses, and calmed sobbing families on the worst days of their lives. Her soap opera son and her ego trip? That didn't scare me. If anything, it made me curious just how far she'd go before she tripped over her own drama. I smiled as I set the alarm system and whispered to myself, "You picked the wrong paramedic to mess with. Let the games begin." The morning after the attempted eviction fiasco, I stood on my porch sipping coffee and watching the neighborhood stir. Karen's house across the street was already alive with activity. Her SUV parked sideways like it had skidded into the driveway on purpose, and several bags being loaded by a young man who looked like he'd just walked off the set of a failed reality show. He had bleached hair in a top knot, wore a tank top with the word Vibes stretched across the front, and held a phone like it was fused to his hand. I could hear him complaining loudly that the light wasn't good enough for his live stream. This, apparently, was Karen's son, the one who desperately needed my home for healing. He didn't look traumatized. He looked like he needed an unfollow button. He walked over without knocking, like the front steps were a red carpet. I opened the door before he reached for the handle. He gave me a smug smile and said, "Hey man, Mom said we could start moving in soon, just need a spot for my meditation tent and maybe some natural light in the guest room." I didn't answer. I simply pointed toward the street and said, "I think your healing might be more effective in your own house. Or maybe in a therapist's office." He scoffed, said something about toxic masculinity, and wandered back to his mom's driveway where Karen was now watching through binoculars like some nosy park ranger. I didn't even get to finish my coffee before another HOA notice was hand-delivered. This one summoned me to a conflict resolution session scheduled at the clubhouse later that day. According to the note, both parties would be given a chance to present their emotional grievances and share property-based intentions in a healing dialogue. It read like a script written by someone who had never taken a law course but had binge-watched too much self-help content. I wasn't planning to go until Janine called and told me to absolutely attend, with one caveat: record everything. She'd be joining me in person. The clubhouse was full when I arrived, packed with HOA members who clearly had no idea what they'd signed up for. Karen was seated in front, her son lounging beside her and scrolling through his phone. The moment I walked in, she stood and addressed the room like she was delivering a State of the Union address. She spoke about mental wellness, the importance of environment in recovery, and how my home had healing potential that couldn't be ignored. She cried. Real tears, or at least drops of water conveniently placed for effect. Then came the part that made me drop my pen. Karen presented a letter allegedly written by her son's therapist, stating that he required relocation to a more peaceful, water-adjacent home to heal from severe post-breakup anxiety. The therapist's name was Dr. Philomena Vibes. I looked at Janine. She looked back at me. No such therapist was listed anywhere in the state registry, and I'd bet my kayak that Karen printed that from Canva. I stood to respond, but Janine beat me to it. She pulled out a manila folder, slapped it on the table, and began reading real documents: my deed, legal titles, HOA registration confirmations, and a list of licensed therapists in the state that didn't include anyone named Philomena Vibe. She also included screenshots of Karen's social media posts where she bragged about staging a takeover of my home. One post even included a caption that read manifesting a healing center by summer, thanks to some creative legal paths. People in the room shifted uncomfortably. One woman muttered that this was starting to sound illegal. A man in the back raised his hand and asked why the HOA was involved in someone's private breakup. Karen's son finally looked up from his phone and, to everyone's surprise, stood up. He said, loudly, "I don't even want to live in that house. Mom's the one obsessed with it. She says the lighting is perfect for her cooking videos and that she wants a second kitchen where she can film in natural light." The room fell silent. Karen's eyes went wide. She grabbed his arm and whispered something furious, but the damage was done. Janine turned to the board and said, "I believe that concludes this healing session." Outside, people were already whispering. One board member approached me and apologized, saying they had no idea this was going to become a reality show. I assured them there were no hard feelings, but I also warned that I would not tolerate another attempt to misuse HOA procedures to settle personal vendettas. They nodded and said things would be handled internally. Back at home, I updated my security settings. I installed 2 more cameras and set up a new motion-triggered audio warning at the edge of my property line. It simply said this property is under surveillance and protected by law. Step back unless you want your 5 minutes of fame on courtroom TV. Karen didn't show her face that evening. But her son, hilariously, posted an Instagram story where he apologized to his followers for the healing retreat not working out and announced he'd be taking a trip to Costa Rica to detox from all the stress. He ended the post by asking his followers to Venmo him for spiritual restoration expenses. Janine texted me a screenshot of it with one word captioned underneath: clown. But this wasn't over. I knew Karen well enough to realize that public embarrassment was only going to make her more dangerous. She'd tasted defeat, and that taste was bitter. Which meant she was going to come back swinging, probably not with facts or logic, but with manipulation, drama, and whatever half-baked strategy she could dream up next. I wasn't scared. I was ready. Let her try again. Let her bring her fake therapists, her crystals, her yoga mats, her pseudo-spiritual nonsense. I had the law on my side, and more importantly, I had patience. The next round was coming. And this time, I'd be recording everything. 3 days of silence from Karen was enough to raise my suspicion more than her usual antics ever did. She wasn't the type to quit, not after being humiliated in front of the entire HOA and her son outing her obsession with my house. I figured she was either cooking up something worse or trying to rally support from whatever remaining board members still tolerated her. Either way, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. So I updated my home security system with motion-triggered alerts, added a new HD camera on the side yard, and linked everything to my cloud backup. I even had a GPS-tagged sensor installed on my kayak rack, just in case she thought of going after that too. You never know how low someone will stoop when they've convinced themselves they're entitled to what's yours. Then, on Thursday afternoon, I got the alert. Motion detected at side gate. I tapped into the live feed from my phone and saw them. 2 figures creeping along the fence line in broad daylight, ducking behind bushes like children playing spy games. One of them wore a camo hoodie and carried a duffel bag that looked way too full. The other was in an HOA polo shirt, oversized and tucked into cargo shorts, as if that made him official. They reached the side entrance and tried to force it open with a crowbar. That was when my pre-recorded message blasted through the outdoor speaker, startling them like deer in headlights. The voice calmly said, "Warning, you are trespassing on private property. Law enforcement has been notified. Please leave immediately." One of them panicked and dropped the crowbar. The other fumbled with his phone, apparently trying to silence a ringtone while stepping backward into a bush. I watched the entire show unfold with popcorn in hand from my living room. They eventually fled, tripping over the same sprinkler head twice. I saved the footage and immediately sent it to Janine, who called back laughing harder than I've ever heard her before. She said this was golden and told me not to call the cops yet. Instead, she had a better idea. Within 2 hours, she had filed a civil injunction request against Karen and any individuals acting on her behalf. She added a cease and desist clause and an emergency restraining component for attempted illegal entry. Then, she arranged a press-friendly drop. That evening, I went live on a neighborhood community app with a side-by-side playback of Karen's past claims and her new goons caught red-handed trying to break in. People flooded the comments. Some were outraged, others shocked, but most of them were clearly entertained. And that's when I noticed something unexpected. One of the trespassers had gone live from his own account while on my property. Apparently, they were planning to stream a spiritual cleansing of the space as part of Karen's supposed healing ritual. The video title literally read "Cleansing HOA Members' Stolen Space Live." The irony was too rich. The next morning, my doorbell rang. I checked the camera and saw Karen standing there, arms crossed, flanked by the 2 trespassers now trying to look like peacemakers. I stepped out with my phone already recording. Karen started speaking before I could say a word. She claimed her team had simply mistaken the property line and were performing a community wellness inspection. I asked if inspections usually involved crowbars and live streaming without consent. Her face twitched slightly, but she powered through with a long-winded excuse about energy fields and legal misunderstandings. Then she said the dumbest thing I'd heard yet. She told me that if I didn't drop the complaint, she would consider me personally responsible for obstructing her son's emotional development. That was when I played the security footage aloud on my phone, loud enough for everyone within 50 feet to hear. As the voices of her cronies played back, clearly discussing how to sneak in before I got home, her expression darkened. She turned to one of them and hissed something, but I didn't catch it. Then she stomped away like a sitcom villain. The others followed her, heads low. Janine called me 2 hours later to let me know the judge had reviewed the footage and signed the order. Karen was now legally barred from coming within 20 feet of my property line, and any attempt to interact with me directly could be considered harassment. Janine made it clear this would escalate to criminal charges if repeated. It was a small but satisfying victory. Still, I knew Karen's ego wouldn't tolerate this blow. I was proven right the next day. An HOA flyer appeared on every door in the neighborhood. The headline read "Urgent Special Vote to Reclaim Community Wellness Space." The document laid out a proposal for rezoning my house as a temporary emotional recovery zone under HOA jurisdiction. There was even a mock-up graphic of my home with candles drawn in every window and a banner that read "Healing Lives Here." I wanted to scream and laugh at the same time. She was literally trying to vote my home out of my own name using HOA policy. But this time, she wasn't being sneaky. She was going all in. What Karen didn't count on was how many neighbors were now on my side. The live stream, the trespassing, the exposed fake therapy letters, they'd all done real damage to her credibility. So I did the one thing she couldn't stand. I let her talk. I let her send out flyers. I let her build momentum. And all the while, I compiled everything: screenshots of comments, video clips of her son calling the whole thing a lie, and even footage of Karen from earlier that week trying to move my porch swing onto her lawn claiming it was on the community registry. By the time the emergency HOA meeting took place, the clubhouse was packed. Karen came dressed like she was running for office, standing behind a podium with lavender candles and handing out pamphlets that said "Reclaim Wellness." She gave a long, rambling speech about the spiritual decay of the neighborhood and how she was trying to bring balance and light through communal healing. Then she turned to me with a forced smile and invited me to speak about my resistance. I walked up with Janine at my side. I said nothing for the first 15 seconds. Instead, I projected the live stream of the break-in attempt on the wall. Then I played the audio of her son stating she was using the house for her cooking content. Then I handed out copies of her fake therapist letter to everyone in the room. I ended with one question: "Does this look like healing to you?" The room exploded with voices. The HOA president stood and called for a recess. Karen tried to yell something about misinterpretation and community vision, but nobody was listening anymore. For the first time, she looked genuinely nervous. She had overplayed her hand. When I left the building, 2 neighbors clapped me on the back. One whispered thank you for finally dealing with her. Another said she was about to vote against the proposal anyway, but now couldn't wait to watch her lose. I nodded and walked home slowly, knowing this war wasn't over, but we were getting closer to the final round. And I was ready for it. The next morning came with the distant sound of hammering and the faint whiff of burned incense. I opened my blinds to see Karen and a small group of her followers setting up what looked like a ceremonial structure in the park directly across from my house. It had a wooden frame, colorful streamers, and a giant cloth banner that read "Community Healing Starts Now." A folding table held stacks of pamphlets and what I assumed were jars of essential oils. I stood there staring at the scene, half expecting someone to start chanting. But instead of a meditation circle or quiet gathering, it quickly turned into a full-blown rally. She had speakers mounted, a mic in her hand, and she began barking slogans like "Reclaim the Healing Space" and "Vote Wellness." It was surreal, like I had woken up in the middle of a satire skit with no punchline. Neighbors wandered over out of curiosity, some visibly confused, others just drawn in by the free herbal tea Karen's team was handing out. Her son was there too, now wearing a flowing white robe and walking barefoot on the grass, as if that alone proved he was on a higher spiritual plane. He told someone loudly that the vibrations of the soil were chaotic and that my house's presence was blocking the energy flow. I recorded the whole thing from my porch, sipping coffee as if I were watching the world's most unhinged documentary in real time. Then came the real twist. Karen announced that there would be an official HOA vote at the event to approve the transition of my property into a designated emotional renewal zone. She claimed the board had been given full authorization to pass the motion on behalf of the community. I immediately texted Janine and sent her the video. Her response was simple. She's either about to break 6 civil codes or set herself on fire with her own nonsense. Either way, I'm grabbing popcorn. I decided to attend. Not because I had faith in the process, but because I didn't trust Karen to speak in front of a crowd without warping reality. By the time I reached the park, the mood had shifted. Some neighbors were nodding along while others looked uncomfortable. Karen had passed out pre-written ballots that only said yes or absolutely. Janine showed up moments later in full professional mode, her briefcase in one hand and her phone camera in the other. She didn't say a word. She just walked up to the main table and asked to see the bylaws authorizing this vote. Karen laughed nervously and said it was spiritual authority, not legal. That was her first mistake. Janine pulled out a printed copy of the HOA's actual bylaws and began reading aloud. Section 12 clearly stated that property rezoning for temporary use required not only unanimous board approval but also written consent from the current owner. That was me. I looked directly at Karen and said my consent is not given. Her smile cracked like thin ice. She tried to wave it off by telling the crowd not to worry, that legal language was just a formality, and that energy was more important than signatures. But the audience wasn't buying it anymore. Just when I thought things couldn't get more absurd, Karen lit what she called the ceremonial bonfire. It was a metal drum filled with herbs, old pamphlets, and what she said were written declarations of trauma release. But instead of a gentle flame, the thing erupted with a pop and sent a mushroom of smoke spiraling into the air. Someone screamed. The fire marshal, who had apparently been called by a concerned resident, arrived within 10 minutes and doused the whole setup with a hose. Karen tried to protest but ended up coughing violently from the smoke, mascara streaking down her face. While the crowd dispersed, still stunned from the impromptu explosion, Janine walked right up to the HOA president, a guy named Carl who had always kept his distance from the drama. She handed him a folder and said it was time the board reviewed the damage Karen had done to the HOA's credibility. Carl flipped through the folder, which included printed screenshots, legal notes, video stills, and a list of complaints from residents who had texted Janine privately after Karen's antic. He didn't argue. He just nodded, looked over at Karen, who was now sitting on the grass fanning herself with a smoldering pamphlet, and muttered, "This has gone way too far." That evening, I received a message slipped under my door. It was a formal notice from the HOA board, announcing an emergency internal vote to review Karen's status and privileges as a board member. The meeting would be held in 2 days, and her conduct was the only item on the agenda. I couldn't help but smile. I knew Karen wouldn't go down without throwing one last tantrum, but this was the beginning of the end. She had tried cops, fake therapists, break-ins, spiritual retreats, and now open-fire ceremonies. Nothing worked. Her desperation was catching up to her. Then came the final twist of the day. A man named David stopped by my place. He introduced himself as a property developer and said he owned several lots just outside HOA jurisdiction. One of them, he explained, was the adjacent vacant lot that Karen had apparently been eyeing for months. She had made multiple offers, all rejected. He said she was convinced it would allow her to expand her so-called healing zone and that she had been aggressively negotiating for weeks. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me an email Karen had mistakenly sent him, assuming he was someone else. In it, she wrote that if she couldn't buy his lot, she would trigger a public zoning challenge using my son's medical narrative to pressure the board. David asked if I'd be interested in buying the lot from him instead. I didn't hesitate. The paperwork was quick, the payment cleared the next day, and I officially became the owner of the very lot Karen had been fantasizing about for over a year. I didn't build anything on it. I didn't even mow it. I just put up one wooden sign at the edge, facing her house. It read, "Healing complete, please redirect energy elsewhere." The next 2 days were quiet. Karen didn't host another gathering. Her followers thinned out, the banners were taken down, and even her son stopped posting about the journey of reclaiming harmony. The house across the street sat eerily still, and I could almost feel the storm brewing inside. She knew what was coming, and so did I. The final act was approaching, and it would take place under the harshest light of all. An open HOA vote, the kind she used to dominate. This time, it would be her under the magnifying glass. And this time, nobody was looking away. The day of the emergency HOA meeting began with a strange calm. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace, but the heavy, waiting kind that lingered before a storm. From my porch, I could see Karen's house still shuttered up, like she was either preparing for battle or hiding from one. For once, her son wasn't outside parading around in linen robes or filming his healing mantras. Even the wind seemed to carry a hush through the streets, as if the entire neighborhood understood something was finally about to end. I ironed a plain blue shirt, brushed off the dust from a chair in my garage, and loaded a folder full of printed exhibits that Janine had prepared. It was time to close this ridiculous chapter once and for all. By the time I arrived at the clubhouse, the parking lot was completely full. Cars lined both sides of the street, and neighbors walked shoulder to shoulder toward the doors like they were heading into court rather than a community vote. The mood inside was tense but buzzing. Whispers spread from row to row, people trading stories, rumors, and side eyes as Karen finally entered through the side door, dressed in a beige pantsuit and oversized sunglasses like she thought she was walking into a press conference instead of a reckoning. Her son trailed behind her silently, no cameras, no live stream, no sage stick. Just silence. Carl, the HOA president, called the meeting to order with a tired but firm voice. He skipped all the usual small talk and read the agenda out loud. One item only: a vote on whether to remove Karen from her position on the HOA board, citing abuse of authority, falsification of documents, misuse of emergency services, and multiple violations of community trust. Karen raised her hand immediately, insisting she be given a chance to speak before any vote. Carl nodded but warned her that she had 5 minutes and that no further extensions would be allowed. She walked to the front like she had practiced this moment in the mirror 100 times. Her speech started off in predictable fashion. She spoke about community, unity, healing, the importance of emotional spaces, and how her son's well-being should never have been politicized. She claimed she only acted out of love for the neighborhood and her deep belief in holistic balance. Then she tried to twist it into a martyr story, claiming she was being punished for caring too much. A few sympathetic murmurs floated through the air, but most of the room stayed quiet, watching her carefully, like they'd finally figured out who they were really dealing with. When she finished, Janine stood up without waiting for a prompt. She carried the same folder we'd prepared and handed copies to each board member. Then, with the calm of someone who'd dismantled frauds for a living, she recounted everything Karen had done from the beginning. The false 911 report. The fake therapist letter. The recorded break-in attempt. The illegal bonfire. The coercive wellness vote. And finally, the email to the property owner about triggering a zoning challenge with a fake medical narrative. There were no theatrics, just facts. And facts, laid bare, have a weight that Karen couldn't deflect. She tried to interject, but Carl shut her down firmly. He told her she'd had her chance. Now it was time to vote. The board members voted one by one. Each vote to remove her echoed with finality. 5 yes votes. 1 abstention. 0 in her favor. The moment Carl announced that the motion had passed, there was no cheer, no applause, just an audible exhale from the room. Karen stood frozen for a second, like she hadn't expected to actually lose. Then she turned, eyes narrowed at me, and muttered something under her breath that I didn't catch. Her son followed her silently, hands shoved in his hoodie pockets. And just like that, the Queen of Chaos was dethroned. But the story didn't end there. A week later, I got a knock on the door. It was her son. He stood on my porch, awkward and fidgety, holding a small envelope and car keys. He said he wanted to apologize. Not just for himself, but for everything his mother had dragged him into. He admitted that he never wanted the house, never cared about the healing nonsense, and only went along with it because she threatened to cut off his expenses if he didn't play along. Then he surprised me. He said he was moving out of state and asked if I'd be interested in buying his Jeep. Said he needed the money for a clean start. I paused for a moment, then nodded. Not because I needed a new vehicle, but because I knew the symbolism of that moment. I paid full price. 2 days later, I had the Jeep parked in my driveway, freshly washed and registered in my name. I left it there, in full view of Karen's front windows. She didn't come out. Not once. I don't know if she even looked anymore. Her world, once tightly controlled by her will and her whims, had crumbled from the inside out. There were no more flyers, no more chants, no more mystical declarations of wellness zones. Just silence. And for the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood finally felt normal. I walked across the street to the lot I had bought, the one she had obsessed over for months. I hadn't touched it yet, hadn't landscaped or fenced it. I just stuck a single wooden post in the center and nailed a sign to it. It said healing complete in plain letters, nothing flashy, no sarcasm. Just a quiet full stop to the madness. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned gold, I sat on my porch and watched the light stretch across my lawn. No cop cars. No drum circles. No HOA volunteers with clipboards trying to reassign my living room. Just quiet. I thought back to the moment when those flashing red and blue lights first lit up my driveway and Karen stood there declaring that I was depriving her son of the space to heal. How far we had come from that ridiculous lie, and how much had unraveled simply because she couldn't accept that ownership didn't come from belief, or manipulation, or vibes. It came from truth, from law, and from people who refused to be bullied. I went back inside, closed the door gently, and turned off the lights. There would be no more chapters to this story. Karen had written herself out.